Well, good morning everyone, and you're all very welcome to the Festival of Politics 2025. My name is David McGill and I'm the Clerk and Chief Executive of the Scottish Parliament, and I'm delighted to see so many people with us this morning. If I can, I would just like to say a very quick word about George Reid, our second presiding officer, who you might have seen died sadly 10 days or so ago. This whole festival was George's idea, and I freely admit that there were quite a few of us who scratched their heads when George suggested a festival of politics. I mean, a festival of politics? But he was right, we were wrong, and here we are 21 years later, more than 100,000 people through the door in that time, so it's testament to his vision and determination that we've had such a successful programme over those 21 years. So we've got an excellent session for you today. I'm really looking forward to everyone getting involved in it. Holyrood 2026, the big issues, and I'm really interested to hear what the next hour and a half is going to bring. I'm thinking through some of the challenges that I'm going to face in my role, my staff are going to face, but I'm sure we haven't thought of everything, so I'm really looking forward to both what our panel has to say and what you have to say. This morning's event is in partnership with the Centre for Public Policy at the University of Glasgow, and later on I'll be inviting you all to get involved in various ways, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. It's really important that everybody that wants to contribute is able to contribute, and that we do so respectfully even when we hear things that we don't agree with. So if you could just bear that in mind when you're contributing. So before we get on to questions later on in the session, you're more than welcome to comment live if that's the kind of thing you want to do. You can do that on X by using @VisitScottParl or on Instagram @ScottParl. And I should also mention that this morning's session will be recorded and we will be broadcasting it on the Parliament's YouTube channel in a few weeks' time. So, to this morning's event, I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Hayley Bennett, Professor Nicola McEwen, Professor Graham Roy, and Professor Shannon Valla. Hayley Bennett is a senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Edinburgh. Her research examines the design and delivery of social services, labour market, and anti-poverty policies. She's an executive member of the Social Policy Association. Nicola McEwen is Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Glasgow and Director of the university's Centre for Public Policy. She was founding co-director of the Centre on Constitutional Change, where she remains a research fellow. Nicola has published widely in the field of territorial politics, nationalism, multi-level government and policy making. Graham Roy is Professor in Economics at the University of Glasgow and Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission. Between 2016 and 2021, he led the Fraser of Allender Institute and is a former senior civil servant. He's a past advisor to the Scottish Parliament's Economy Committee and an elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And finally, Professor Valla is the Baillie Gifford Chair in Ethics of Data and AI at the University of Edinburgh, where she directs the Edinburgh Future Institute's Centre for Techno-Normal Futures and co-directs the UK Research and Innovation Bridging Responsible AI Divides programme. She's the author of the AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. And finally, I'd like to welcome BSL interpreters today. We have Robert Skinner and Shauna Dixon on the screen, and Rachel Wilson is in the room. So if we do have any BSL users, you're more than welcome to use that method to put any questions that you want to put to the panel. So as I say, there'll be an opportunity later on for you all to ask questions of the panel. I'm shortly going to ask panel members to spend about 5 minutes setting out how they see the next session and beyond, and what the challenges for the elected politicians will have in that time are. But before we get there, a wee bit of interaction. If I could direct you to the screens, we should have a QR code, and I would ask you to download the Slido app onto your phones. Right.
Oh, what does that mean?
I'm not sure that we have the QR code yet.
So Oh, do you want to help?
Here we go. Here's the QR code on at least one of the screens.
Is it working? So, Kimberly, to the rescue, I think it needs to be activated.
We're just getting colleagues to organise that at the back. Well, the questions that we're going to ask you through the Slido app are going to come later, so while that's being sorted out, I think we can just move straight on to the 5-minute piece from each of our panel members on their thoughts on the challenges for the next session. And I'm going to ask Dr. Hayley Bennett to kick us off. Hayley.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to talk about poverty and inequality. So Scotland's got a long history with poverty and inequality, and I think quite sadly it's also the future. I think we're going to continue to see issues around poverty and inequality. The fortune of where you're born and to whom still matters, unfortunately, to your life chances, your probability of experiencing poverty, and any opportunities that you might have. Scotland still experiences spatial, gender, race, disability and class-based inequalities. And many will argue there's a moral imperative to address poverty, but there's also an economic and democratic one as well. So it's going to be increasingly important for whoever's governing Scotland after the 2026 election. It'll need to be high on the policy agenda. Now, the Scottish welfare state, of what we think of as the welfare state in Scotland, quite complex. It's multi-level. So some things are operated by the UK government and policies designed by them, and some increasingly more since 2016 by the Scottish Parliament. But it's a complex area when we think about the policies for addressing poverty. What we might see in the future in terms of anti-poverty policies and what they aim to do is likely or possibly will change after the 2026 election. There's been somewhat consensus in the Scottish anti-poverty community for the last 10 years around how to address poverty, and mainly that's fallen on mitigating UK government welfare reforms. It's been quite reactive to UK government policies. I think that will need to change. I don't think it will continue to be the pattern of shaving the harshest edges off UK government policies. Generally, that means spending more on social security and cash transfers in a kind of reactive way. However, even though the Scottish Government has addressed and invested quite a bit in addressing child poverty, so new legislation around child poverty targets, a new benefit, a Scottish child payment, child poverty and inequality do persist, and child poverty is around 23%. In some places like Glasgow, it's 39%. The JRF, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, approximate there's 240,000 children experiencing poverty in Scotland right now. So that's, I'm sure most of us would agree, an unacceptable situation to be in. So whoever's governing post-2026 will still have this issue to address and need to address it. So the 2026 offers a bit of a juncture for how we think about addressing poverty and inequality. I think we've experienced a series of crises since 2008 around the labour market and working poverty and in-work inequalities. So we've seen a decline of incomes in real terms, job quality, job stability, job security. Wages in a number of sectors have not kept up with inflation, and some have not kept up with the basics of fuel, housing, and fuel prices, obviously. Our employment protections are weak and poorly enforced. 60% of working age adults in poverty and 75% of children in poverty are living in a household where someone is in paid work in Scotland. So we've got huge issues here around working poverty and how we address that. So I'd like to see post-2026, I'm not sure you asked me to say what I'd like to see, but what I'd like to see post-2026 is more critical approaches to how we think about policy development in Scotland, more policy ideas that offer broader and possibly more radical responses to labour market inequalities than we've seen so far, And I think what we'll need to do to achieve that is shift towards a more cooperative approach between the Scottish Government and the UK Government in how to do that. And that is because so many things remain reserved at the UK Government level. There are also global issues that affect the labour market that are well beyond Scotland's control and need to work in a more complementary policy approach. I've got a final point, which we need to mention that the context of all this is the rise of the right and the far right in politics. And that matters for social policy scholars and analysts because the right-wing and far-right parties tend to have alternative views on social security and welfare provisions. Particularly around employment policies. And these contrast with what we've seen in Scotland in the last 10 years and what the Scottish anti-poverty community would promote. The general shift towards right-wing policies across Europe, the UK, the US. Many advocate for completely reducing social spending, so reducing social security spending. Others who want social security spending are focused on more chauvinistic models, so supporting certain people and certain family units. Again, that differs from the conversations we've had. And these are quite loud voices. And although they're kind of small voices at the moment, Reform has a small number of voters relatively in the UK, these voices are spreading and the ideas too. So some survey research I conducted with Edinburgh colleagues found that the least accurate knowledge on the welfare state and the economy, the people with the least accurate knowledge tend to hold the strongest anti-welfare views. So they've got more strong opinions, even though the knowledge about it was the most inaccurate. And that includes supporting privatisation, as well as cutting back the welfare state. And these were often supporters of right-wing parties. And YouGov have recently been exploring people who are attracted to Reform Party politics. They're also not supportive of social spending. 60% agree that benefits are too generous, which they tend not to be in a relative perspective. And about half of Reform voters actually say they have negative views of benefit recipients. The average for the rest of the population is 12% of the population thinks that. So these are quite different views. So while it is still a small party, because of the multi-level arrangement, because of the way ideas are discussed, I think it is a space for us to watch. And for whoever's here post-2026 election, there will be some influence that may be more anti-welfare in nature than what we've seen before.
Okay, thank you very much, Hayley. I'm going to turn to Graham Roy next for his thoughts.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. And it's a huge pleasure to be here with you this morning. As Chair of the Fiscal Commission, it's probably not surprising that the thing that probably I think is going to be the most important aspect in thinking ahead to 2026 is the overarching fiscal context that will set the framework for all the debates around policy. So just looking at the list of ideas that are coming up there, fundamentally our ability to achieve these objectives is going to be dependent upon the overall fiscal envelope. So essentially how much money this Parliament has to spend on these key issues. And the next year is actually going to be a really important period for Scotland's budget. So the election actually in 2026 will be the first election where pretty much all the powers, all the fiscal powers that were promised in the Smith Commission after the independence referendum are now going to be essentially live. Over the last 10 years, these powers have been coming on stream over time, and this will be the first election where the parties will be able to look at the full suite of potential powers available. So that will be, again, really fascinating to see how that debate plays out. Secondly, we're actually promised a spending review, the first spending review we've had in a very long time in Scotland toward the end of this year. Now that might sound a bit kind of geeky, a bit kind of detailed, but it's a really important time in the kind of public policy profile, the public policy landscape for any government, for any parliament, because it's an opportunity for the government of the day to essentially do a really deep dive into spending priorities and to see how they're aligned with the outcomes that they want to achieve. And the fact that that will come just a few months before the election will really important kind of stake in the ground for how the debates will be framed in the run-up to May's election. And there's a couple of really big important things for us, I think, for us to think about as we look through to where that debate will go. And some of the really big challenges that face whoever is going to win the election next May in terms of the overall envelope, the overall amount of money they're going to have to spend. Still, the largest element of the Scottish budget is determined by the block grant from Westminster. Has anyone been watching if anyone's been watching the news recently, the UK fiscal position is still under quite significant pressure. The outlook for the block grant is projected to be really tight over the next few years, particularly the first few years of the Parliament. So there's not going to be a huge amount of money flowing through from Westminster. On the powers that the Scottish Parliament control, on things like devolved taxes, again, it's a bit of a mixed bag there, where the government have been trying to raise additional revenues through increasing tax rates and doing progressive policies around bans, but actually the amount of money being raised is disappointed, and it will come in at the same level that government might have hoped. And then on the spending side, we see pressures emerging on things like Social Security, where government is, as Hayley said, quite significantly trying to invest in additional top-ups, additional new policies around Social Security. But that comes with a bill, that comes with a cost, and that is coming with additional spending pressures that the government are having to meet. And again, the next Parliament will really think about, what do we do next? Do we continue to increase the investment in there? Do we look for other opportunities to try and tackle these outcomes? And on the general day-to-day spending side, I mean, anyone who's looking at pressures within the NHS or in education, you can just see some of the underlying pressures that are coming from really tight budget settlements that are flowing through to all different aspects of the public sector. And maybe we'll come on to this. I mean, one of the things that keeps me awake at night as chair of the Fiscal Commission is looking beyond the next couple of years to the long-term pressures that are coming down the line, and how we can have an honest conversation as a country about how do we continue to invest and support the healthcare we want to have for everybody as a nation, as our population ages. How can we make the significant investments we need as a country in order to tackle the climate emergency and achieve net zero? These are all big ticket items. They're all things which I think, looking at the list here, everybody agrees are priorities, but they need to be paid for, and we need to have a really honest debate about prioritisation, taxation, and what are the trade-offs in all of that. And I think there's then just one final thought, I guess, asking about what I would like to see in 2026. I think for me, the importance of having a really frank debate about where priorities are, about where trade-offs are going to be. I think there's a real onus on the current government to set out what their priorities will be. They have the resources through the spending review to be quite clear about where the challenges are going to come through and where the opportunities are. There's also a real onus on parliamentarians more broadly, particularly the opposition parties, to come forward with honest opinions about what they're going to do. It's easy to call for more. It's easy to say we need more money on housing, or we need more money on tackling poverty, but how is that going to be funded? Is it going to be funded through higher taxation? Is it going to be funded through cuts in spending elsewhere? And I think there's a real test for parliamentarians about the maturity of that debate. We now have significant more powers and levers, and I think the test will be how honest and frank will that debate be with the people of Scotland, so that we can, whatever your political views, whatever your priorities, we can make an informed choice in the upcoming election.
Thank you very much, Graham. So next I'm going to call on Shannon Valla. So over to you, Shannon.
Thanks. So it may seem I'm here to talk about something that's quite narrow and kind of tightly focused on technology, and that's artificial intelligence. But in fact, AI is now destabilizing and bringing great uncertainty to every single one of the policy themes on that screen, from healthcare and social care to the workforce and employment, to climate change, to social cohesion, to mental health. AI is now a factor in all of those policy challenges. And it's becoming something like a new kind of infrastructure that is not just added to the way we do things, but fundamentally transforms them at their root. But along with that is a great deal of uncertainty. And particularly for voters, they are hearing contrary messages about AI and what it means for their futures in pretty much every domain. So they're hearing, on the one hand, that AI is going to be this incredible engine of economic growth for Scotland and the UK. But at the same time, they're hearing that AI is going to take their jobs. They're hearing that AI is going to be the thing that's going to help us address and create more access to mental health care for vulnerable people. But at the same time, they're hearing that interactions with AI chatbots are causing this rising epidemic of mental health crises and delusions among people who are having their views distorted by these interactions with AI chatbots. They're hearing that AI is going to be this great new tool for learning in the classroom, but they're also hearing that students are now using AI to do their thinking for them. They're hearing that AI is going to be the thing that will help us tackle climate change and discover new efficiencies, but voters are also hearing that AI is going to be this huge drain on our fossil fuel reserves and electricity and water. So I think that presents a tremendous challenge for policymakers and for parliamentarians to think about how do we help the public understand the reality underneath all of these conflicting claims and address the anxieties and uncertainties around AI that are rising every day. How do we help voters kind of cut through that noise? And how do we position our own policies and our own stance in a way that's going to earn trust from the Scottish public over the long term? Because a lot of policymakers actually don't know where the truth lies in these debates. And so policymakers are dealing with their own uncertainties around these issues and the different competing narratives that come from different positions on the political spectrum, as well as the kind of geopolitical dimension of this outside of Scotland. So I think the real issue for 2026 is how can those who represent members of the Scottish public help the Scottish public feel more confident and less fearful and less confused about what AI represents for the future of Scotland.
Shannon, thank you very much for that. That's very thought-provoking. So finally, I'm going to ask Nicola McEwen to address the audience.
Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody for coming along today. We really appreciate it. I wanted to focus not so much on the what, but the how. So my colleagues have all spoken about the scale of policy challenges, technological challenges, fiscal challenges that our next set of parliamentarians are going to face. Are they up to it? Do we have the confidence that they will be up to it? And it's not without significant challenge, because whoever makes up and forms the next administration, there are no easy choices to make. There are mostly only hard choices, which means stopping doing some things in order to be able to do other things. Looking at the priority areas that people have up here, pretty much all of those cannot be delivered by this Parliament alone or the government that it elects. So it will need to be able to work collaboratively and in the spirit of collaboration. And that's where I have concerns. So we are a ways away from the election. I don't like to predict outcomes a week in advance, let alone 9 months in advance. But I think we can be pretty confident that we will end up with a fragmented parliament where there is not a single-party majority. And single-party majorities in the Scottish parliamentary system are extremely unusual. We've had one once. It was a big surprise to many people, and it's unlikely, extremely unlikely, to be repeated next year. So we will have a parliament of minorities. Nothing new in that. But I think we will have a parliament of minorities that may find it more difficult to work across party lines, partly because of the nature of the relationships that have emerged over recent years, and we have seen an increasing polarisation among the parties now, not necessarily because they have very different ideological views or very different policy views. Quite often they don't. Quite often it's personal or historical, and that's unfortunate for the impact that that has on the ability of the Parliament to do its job and its representative role and its job in tackling some of the really big challenges. There is also a new player in town that is almost certainly going to have significant representation in Parliament that will change the atmosphere again. Hayley talked about it in terms of social security and the welfare consensus that has existed for a long time across the parties, not necessarily being there. I think we can also say the same of climate change, of the transition to net zero, another issue which has generated cross-party consensus that we can no longer take for granted. And that in itself is not a bad thing. You know, it's healthy to have debate about these issues. But the question remains for me about the effect of all of that on the ability of the Parliament to do its job in committees, in holding the government to account, and in enabling a government to govern, frankly. So there are some quite significant challenges there. And my worry is that if they're not able to manage and navigate those political challenges and governmental challenges, what does that do to people's trust in the institutions and in the concept of devolution? We already know that trust in the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, has declined quite significantly over the last decade. The Scottish Social Attitudes Survey tracks opinion, and the last available data, which is a couple of years old now, trust in, I think in this case it was the government, but I think if we said Parliament, we'd get pretty much the same, to speak for Scotland, to represent people's interests, to act in the best interests of Scotland, had declined quite significantly from over 70% in 2015 to less than half in 2023 when it was last asked. And that's quite a marked deterioration. And I think if the atmosphere is such that it's difficult to confront these policy challenges and the fiscal challenges, then I think my worry is that it will have a detrimental impact on trust in the institution itself. And, well, I don't think that would be a good thing. So even if there was majority government, right, there won't be, but even if there was, and the Scottish Government cannot deliver things alone. It generally doesn't deliver much at all, and that's not a criticism of it, it's just not its role. It tends to set the framework and relies a lot on delivery partners. So a very big partner in that is local government. And there was an attempt to reset the relationship between Scottish Government and local government with the Verity House Agreement. It helped a little bit, but I think most people in local government would say it hasn't helped enough. And I think what we also hear in the run-up to the election is about the case for greater devolution within Scotland, so an empowering of local government to be able to empower it to manage some of these issues on its own. And that links very closely to the fiscal issues that Graham was talking about, because there are significant challenges in how to finance local government. But I would want to see before, I think it's very easy to say let's devolve within Scotland, but we need to think through what that might mean. Does that mean changing the structures? Does that mean increasing the capabilities? Does that mean living comfortably with different entitlements in different parts of the country? Because inevitably that's what devolution would mean. And what do you do when some local authorities are better able and resourced to deal with some of the challenges than others? Do we need to equalise and share resources? So there are huge questions around devolution within Scotland that I would hope that that debate will be able to unpack. And then there is the relationship between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. It's an area that I've done quite a lot of research on over the years, and the relationship, particularly before the general election, was dire. And that's a problem, because it really matters, because, as Hayley mentioned, there are so many areas of policy that are still reserved, but they have an impact on the responsibilities of this Parliament. So managing that relationship has to be a priority for any administration within Scotland. And it has been better since the last election, since the change of government, but there are still challenges and there are still issues. And let's not forget that in the next Scottish parliamentary session, there will be another UK general election, which may present a whole other challenge, depending on what unfolds there. So I'm really sorry, because that is very doom and gloomy. But I want to go back to one of the principles, of the founding principles of the Scottish Parliament, which is about that sharing of power. And that's partly about the sharing of power that I've been talking about, between the institutions, between government, between Parliament, and I would suggest also the sharing of power locally too. It's also about sharing of power with you, with the people. That's written into the founding principles of the Parliament. David mentioned George Reid, wonderful man, giant of Scottish politics, former presiding officer. And when he, on the opening of this new building, I went back and looked at the speech that he gave then, when he talked about the Parliament belongs to its people. It's been built to invite them in, and here you are, a place where together we can be ambitious for Scotland. So my sort of, I suppose, message to you is that they do actually listen, especially in the run-up to an election. You have voice. So I would, I guess, encourage you to use it, to make demands of your parliamentarians that they step up to these many challenges, that perhaps they can set aside some of the, petty the right word, some of the differences that prevent and inhibit the kinds of collaboration that will be absolutely essential to being able to confront the challenges that they will face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and thanks to all of our panel members for those opening remarks. Now, we've heard from the panel, and it's now time to hear from you. Thank you very much for your contributions to the first Slido question there, and you've already seen the panel taking that into account. I'm kind of tempted to parcel that off and send it off to the incoming government after the next election, because I think it gives a good snapshot of your priorities. We've got a second question for you that I think we're ready to put up. There you go. It's a letter from you to your new MSPs. So it's congratulations on your election to the Scottish Parliament. As our elected representatives for the next 5 years, we want you to be. And if you could just fill in the blank for us. There we go, ready. We've got bold there. One of our panel anticipated that earlier. I was hoping to see the word bold up there. And we've already heard about the need for collaboration. Honest and hard-working, brave, engaged.
I think we should definitely parcel that up and send.
Yes, yeah. So some really excellent comments here. Please do keep them coming, and the panel will be aware of that as they move through the next part of the presentation. I was going to take some time here as the chair to ask some questions of the panel, but I want to protect as much time as possible for your questions, so I think we'll move straight to that. I may use my position as chair to interject at various points, but we have festival assistants who have microphones, so if you would like to ask a question of any of the panel, please raise your hand and keep it raised until a microphone comes to you, and we'll get round as many of you as we possibly can. I can already see as many hands going up. One here in the third row, please, Douglas, and then at the front.
Hi, yes, on Wednesday we had a session here on local government and the structure of it, and I think one of the conclusions the panel and the audience probably came to was about the failure of devolution in Scotland, so that power is not reaching the communities of Scotland. People do not feel they have a connection with their local representatives. Some MSPs have such large communities that cover enormous geographical distances. One of the figures that came out was about comparing with Norway as a population of nearly equal size, that in Scotland we have about 2,000 councillors, for example, and in Norway we have about 12,000. Now there's some details in there that need to be worked, but I think there's a fundamental there about the way that the system doesn't allow governments to operate effectively so that people feel engaged with their politicians, and hence the result of that survey where we're seeing declining trust, along with all the other things that the presenters have spoken about. So I just wonder what the panel's views are on the way that devolution hasn't really happened to engage the population of Scotland in the way that I think it was on that day of the opening of the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you. Hayley, you talked a lot about local communities and the interaction of social policy, welfare policy in community areas. Maybe I can come to you first on that one.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I did some work a few years ago with Oliver Escobar, who's at Edinburgh, who probably wasn't at your event, but does speak a lot about democratic reforms. And he's brought those similar numbers, comparing Scotland to other places in Europe that have got more representatives for the communities. I think there is an issue here. So one of the bits of work we're doing about anti-poverty work is how actually Scotland, the devolution of power to the Scottish government has actually reduced some of the power from local government. So there's a sucking up as well as a pulling down of power. I think that probably will need to change. There has been some initiatives over the last few years about community development, community empowerment, Community Empowerment Act. I think there's a genuine critical question to ask about whether those have been successful to achieve the aims that they set out, which was to empower more communities, that they could have more say in public services. So there is probably some work needed to be done on that. I think especially for anti-poverty, but one of the big words that popped up before around climate change, I think that's also an issue there. I don't think I've answered your question though, but I've talked near it. So
Maybe I can ask Nicola to come in here. The question was about some of the feelings in our democratic institutions, I suppose.
So I think there was an inevitability that there would be some sucking up when you create institutions in Edinburgh that weren't there before, and they become the focus of law, of policy, of media, of demand. There was going to be an inevitability in terms of taking a bit of attention away from some of the local authorities. But I do think we are probably beyond the point where that needs to be re-examined. I don't know if it's just a numbers game about having more councillors. I think it's also about structures and about how you, if you are going to ask more of local governments, you need to empower them to deliver that more. And we need to be comfortable living with the fact that that will mean that there are then variations. A negative way to put that would be postcode lotteries, right? A more positive way is just divergence and divergent preferences leading to divergent outcomes. But we need to be comfortable with the differential nature of that. And we need, I think, to be able to start thinking about, so in federal countries, quite often you get systems of equalisation so that you can help the poorer regions be able to match or keep pace with the wealthier ones. So could East Ayrshire Council match Edinburgh City Council in what it's able to deliver right now? Probably not. And there are the challenges, I think, facing local authorities across the country are so very different. So I think we just need to think about it really carefully about how you do that and how you do it most effectively. But I do think it is a debate that we need to, it's an issue that we do need to examine carefully.
There was a question down here at the front, and then I'll come to some others.
As a preface to my question, there is, I think, a film on the web about from the launch event of the project being led by Leslie Riddick and Esther Robson and people about the hope to have a much wider democratic base, not necessarily the old number of borough councils, but it's all there on the web. My question is a concern, and it's not to denigrate the ability of any candidate in next year's election, but there's no doubt in my mind that just like back in 1999, there will be an intensely steep learning curve for many of them. And I wonder how each of the panel feels the most important issues to be in part of an induction or education programme, and how that is delivered so that the massive range of challenges can be examined by people who are up to speed in areas which have not been their own before they came into the Parliament, because that, given the budget constraints and the budget demands, will be of paramount importance.
Thank you. I'm going to come to each of the panel and turn quickly, since you've directed that panel to each of them, but I'm going to ask Graham, first of all, you and I have already had conversations about the fiscal awareness of elected politicians and what we might do to raise that from day one, so I'll come to you first.
It's a great question, and if you go back to 1999, essentially the funding and the budget of the Scottish Government was pretty straightforward. It was driven by the Barnett formula, which has its own mystique and its own history. But if you look at it, if you look at the system now, for better for worse, through actually asking politicians to come up with a fiscal system, unsurprisingly you get something that tries to be everything to everybody, and then ends up being a bit of a burach and a real complexity in how it's operated. So we have a system now that has got a block grant. We've got a system that's got devolved taxes. We've got a system that's got shared taxes. We've got a system that relies on forecasts and then reconciliations, which means that changes in the budget have an impact potentially 5-6 years further down the line. We have borrowing rules, some for capital, some for revenue. We have a reserve. You can put some money in, but you can't take some money out. We've got rules about when governments can spend money within years and change money within years. We've got block grant adjustments. There's a whole host of different mechanisms there, and I think there is a real big, important issue about just getting everybody up to speed on the complexity of that. But also in many ways, I think most fiscal systems around the world are complex. It's the ability to see through what are the big ticket items, what are the core issues that matter there, and ultimately that comes down to where is the funding coming from, what is the trajectory for the funding, and crucially what's the trajectory for demand on the spending side. And if you take a step back and you look at all of that at the moment, there is a gap, a significant gap between where likely funding is going to come over the next few years and the spending commitments that essentially that governments and parliamentarians are expected to make. And I think understanding that, being able to see through all of that, understand that, and then to be able to have that debate about where the choices and where the prioritisation comes in, that's going to be I think that's going to be a huge challenge for all parliamentarians coming in.
Yeah. Thank you.
37 potentially new MSPs, that's the frightening bit.
Yes, and that's only the number we know just now that are standing down. The final number will be a significantly higher than that, I suspect. I'm going to come to Shannon now. You talked a lot earlier on about the clear pros and cons of different developments in AI. How are we going to get our elected members to make choices in that environment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important here is to understand what's working and delivering results from this technology, and what's still speculative and what's still kind of hoping for things that in the long term might be possible, but we really don't have the knowledge, expertise, or resources to deliver today. So I think one of the dangers of the technology narrative around AI right now, for example, is the idea that it will fix problems that we haven't been able to fix yet by other means. And that can really set people up for failure if the technology isn't yet fit for purpose. So understanding what's been working, both in terms of the fundamental problems of the people that you represent, what has been tried, what with or without technology, what's working, what's not working, what are the really sticky problems that we don't seem to be able to solve by any other means, and then is data, is AI a tool that's fit for purpose to tackle this problem, or is it just a distraction that's actually going to take us away from buckling down and solving and making those hard choices that might actually be what's standing between us and making progress on some of these issues. So there are really some narratives where AI gets talked about as a magic bean solution to a problem that really it's not designed to solve. And so we need parliamentarians to avoid that trap.
Hayley, what do you see as the priorities for the induction of the new intake of MSPs?
There's two things. One links a bit to what Graham was saying. Social security is really complex in terms of what's reserved and what's devolved. And that's not just about policy-making power, but also about funding mechanisms. So if something changes at the UK level, there can be knock-on effects to what's possible in Scotland because there's a kind of an equalised funding model for some policies, but not all. So things vary quite hard. There's a lot of variation in that. So I think MSPs will need to grasp that, because you can't really come out and say we want a policy X if you don't really understand how the funding's going to work for that, or they're just not going to be achievable, which ends up with what Nicola was talking about reducing trust. If you're announcing policies that just can't be made, there's going to be an issue. So I think that would be the first one. And MPs and MSPs struggle with that relationship and understanding what each government can do. It's quite a difficult space. The second one is a bit more human of an answer and less technical, but I think to actually be able to make policies to address poverty, you need to better understand the experiences of poverty. So that could be about lived experience, it could be about travelling to different communities than the ones that you represent, but also some things of understanding the difference between poverty, destitution, deep poverty. These are different experiences, different drivers, different causes, and require different policy solutions. So I think that would be the two things I would suggest.
And Nicola, where do we put our money in the early days of the new session?
So all of the above, but I think it's not just about induction, because I imagine if you are a new parliamentarian coming, or even a re-elected parliamentarian, because it's not just about the newbies. I mean, the devolution is way more complex than it used to be, and technological change happens at such pace that I think there is a need for ongoing learning. But I imagine if you're a newly elected MSP, you come in, you're trying to figure out how to get your pass and how the voting system works, and I'm not sure how much of the sort of deep technical examination of the fiscal framework is maybe going to stay. So I think there is, I would like to see an ongoing learning process, and there is no shortage of expertise on the doorstep of Parliament to be able to support that learning process. So I think just being open, it's okay not to know everything, and being able to access the expertise when you need it.
We had a question right at the back here, and then one in the middle over here. Yep.
Hello. I'm a little bit worried about kind of voter turnout. You know, we have these kind of moments where it kind of ticks up, and I think we get slightly optimistic that people start being more democratic, but then it kind of ticks back down again. At the 2024 general election, turnout was down by about 10% in Scotland. A little bit under, but about 10%. So are there ways that we can get people more democratic without necessarily talking about politics? So my suggestion would be about the economy and making that more democratic for people. So there's an engagement of kind of using their rights. So use it more cooperatives or social enterprises or employee-owned businesses to kind of back up people's maybe even just confidence and taking part in the democratic process.
Nicola, I think I'll come to you in this one, please.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think taking part in the democratic process should be just down to elections. So I think that we ought to be promoting all sorts of different ways for citizens to feel empowered and feel able to influence outcomes, and some of those suggestions you made may be part of that. In terms of turnout at elections, is very heavily influenced by things like how close the contest is seen to be, and how important, the level of importance that people attach to the outcome. And it's impossible to know that this far in advance. But I think that what happens in a campaign will mobilise people to take part or alienate them. And I think there is a challenge, I suppose, to all of the candidates and the parties to engage in the kind of campaign that might help to bring people with them rather than to turn them off. So I guess that would be my plea.
Shannon, do you have any concerns about the impact of some of the negative aspects of AI on the democratic process, either in the run-up to election or even the security of the election result itself?
Yeah, I suppose my greater concern is the former, that the quality of public discourse and the legitimacy of the information that circulates prior to an election. We know that social media disinformation has been an issue for many election cycles now. But what we're seeing today is the circulation of falsehoods that are both deliberately generated by people and circulated using, for example, AI to generate deep fakes or things like that. But we're also seeing things that aren't deliberate or malicious use of AI, but simply an increasing inability of publics to distinguish between what's true and false in the information that's shared with them. And so the extent to which both fabrications that are generated unintentionally through AI-delivered media and the combination of that with deliberate use of AI to manipulate public opinion and distort it, that just adds to the challenge that publics already had with sorting through the tide of disinformation online. So we have the same challenge that we had in the last election, but it's just now escalating. And we don't have better tools, unfortunately, to deal with that than we did in the previous election. And if anything, some of the tools that people have historically relied on, you know, if you're not sure if something's real or not, Google it. Well, Google is now delivering results through its AI overviews that cannot always be relied upon. So again, and what that causes is a ripple effect of a lack of confidence that voters have that they can believe anything. So what you've seen now is a lot of people online will start doubting things that actually did happen, that are actually real legitimate sources. And if they don't like the message that delivers, they will often say, oh, I bet that's fake. I bet that's AI generated. I bet they didn't really say that. And so we need to tackle that problem urgently in order for the debate leading up to the election to actually serve voters.
With a few hands up in this area here, so yeah, I'll come to the gentleman in the end first of all.
Thanks. I'm very conscious that the UK government has an overarching goal around economic growth or wealth creation, shall we say. I guess my observation within Scotland is that the discourse around the Scottish Parliament is much more about how you spend money. And so I just wondered, given the context of current geopolitics, of the sort of technology changes, whether you see that that is a gap that needs to be addressed over the next few months.
Graham, one for you, I think.
Okay, yeah, so there's a couple of points I would make in there. So clearly the UK government has made growth its number one mission. So they've put economic growth right at the top pedestal of that. The debate in Scotland ebbs and flows between whether economic growth is the priority or whether it's a mechanism to achieve other outcomes. So you go back to the 2007 Salmon administration, that was putting sustainable economic growth at the number one priority of government. Since then, it's kind of more moved into, well, economic growth is a potential way to achieve broader outcomes, or the type of growth matters for the broader outcomes there. And that ultimately is a political choice about what's your relative prioritisation within that. Where growth matters now in a much more significant way than it did, say, back in 1999 at the start of the Parliament is through the fiscal mechanism. So back then, essentially, it didn't really matter too much on a fiscal side, so a spending side of things, about what happened to the Scottish economy, because it was purely determined by the Barnett formula, which is driven at the Westminster level. Whereas now, what matters is not just that, but the relative performance of Scottish tax revenues compared to the UK. And I won't go into more than happy to chat afterwards about the fun of the fiscal framework. But basically what it collapses down to is that it's a relative performance of our tax base compared to the rest of the UK. And there it is quite challenging. In recent times, it has been quite challenging for the Scottish Government and the Scottish budget. So to give you a rough idea of where things are, Scottish Government, through its income tax policies, has been trying to raise additional revenues from higher rate taxpayers. And we estimate that they're trying to achieve around about £1.5 billion worth of additional funding flowing in. They're actually only getting about 600 million of additional revenue coming in, because essentially the tax base is not keeping pace with the rest of the UK. So I think it's going to be a really interesting, fascinating aspect of the debate for 2026. Not only just what is your vision of the economy, so what is your vision of an economy with AI, what's your vision of an economy that helps tackle poverty, but also what is your vision of an economy that generates sufficient tax revenues to support the budget. And a lot of that still depends, as Nicola said, not just on decisions that are taken here, but also decisions that are taken in the UK and more broadly about how they then impact upon the Scottish economy.
With a question in the same row, yes, you've already got your microphone. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my question is about Professor Roy's setting out the fiscal challenges and suggesting that what's important is that the political process generates an honest conversation with the electorate about that. So last year's UK election, there was similarly analysts could see that there were huge fiscal pressures, and the way that the parties responded to that was described as a conspiracy of silence. So do the parties in Scotland have the same incentives to try and downplay these issues? And if they do, what would you change to make sure that those things actually come out in the election debates?
Great. So it's a really great question, and I think part of that comes back to I think as Nicola was saying, what do people essentially engage in that political debate around that? So the Scottish Government, to be fair to them, have actually been really honest about the fiscal challenge that they face. They published something back in May where they said, well, actually, if you just look at what we've committed to and the outlook for the funding that we've set from the Scottish Fiscal Commission, there's going to be a gap by the end of the decade of just over £2.5 billion on the revenue side and about £2 billion on the capital side. Now, to put that in context, because that's just numbers, to put that into context, a Queensferry crossing costs us about £1.3 billion. So if you're looking at a funding gap of about £4.5 billion, that's about 3 Queensferry crossings per annum. That essentially is that the government are saying, well, actually the spending pressures are running ahead of where we are in funding. So these are really big challenges. So I think this is where I think the real onus on, I guess, the parliamentary process, but also the tone of the debate and all parties to essentially set out what you're going to do about not just that funding gap, but if you are going to call for additional policies in other areas, then how are you essentially going to pay for them elsewhere? So there's a role for us, institutions like us, and again, the setting up of institutions like Scottish Fiscal Commission, the role of Audit Scotland, the role of organisations within Parliament, SPICE, etc., to be able to provide the evidence base there, the role of the media to essentially engage in that debate. But ultimately, a lot of that is actually going to come down to individuals and the people of Scotland scrutinising and challenging the policy agendas that are set out by government. Because I think the risk is that if we have that conspiracy of silence, given the scale of the challenges that are coming down the line and the urgency of some of the issues, such as climate change or tackling the ageing population, is that we're essentially going to have a parliament that is not going to take the hard decisions or the tough decisions that are needed in order to meet the challenges that we face.
Hayley, you talked earlier about the growing issue of in-work poverty. How would you like to see that debate captured in the Scottish Parliament in the next session?
well, first, I think it needs to be higher up the agenda. So obviously, child poverty data is horrific, but for a long while, child poverty has been the sole focus, maybe, of how we think about anti-poverty in Scotland. I think in-work poverty has been overlooked, and I think we need to get back to thinking about what that is and how many people are affected. There's a gendered aspect. 7 out of 10 people in work poverty are women. There's certain sectors it affects. So health and social care, for example, which a lot of it is within the remit of the Scottish Parliament, as employers, as procurers, as some kind of regulatory function. So if you want to address in-work poverty, there are actual levers at the disposal of the Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament. But I think there's also more collaboration with the UK government required. So the current UK government has announced a number of strategies intended to address in-work poverty across the UK. So sort of raising the minimum wages, an employment bill, there's meant to be an employment regulator. I think they could be nudged further. I think maybe Scotland could do that, to nudge a bit more towards some of these ideas. There are knock-on effects that directly affect the quality of work in Scotland. So I'd like to see more of that conversation being put forward in the election from lots of parties, actually.
Okay, thank you. A gentleman's been waiting for some time there, but if Douglas could give you a microphone, if I could just come in there for a second. Hayley's talked there about the gendered aspect of that debate, and I've got a question for Nicola McEwen, and it's about the fact that next year, this Parliament will be 26 years old. We have never had a 50-50 split in the gender representation amongst our elected members. And there's been lots of discussions about the effect that has on the types of debates and the type of issues we consider in the Parliament. So, Nicola, in your view, what more can we do? First of all, is this a problem? And what more can we do, not just to get women into elected positions, but to get them to stay in elected positions?
Yes, it's a problem, and I think so. We did pretty well in the last Parliament, not 50-50, but not that far off it. We're probably going to take a step back at the next election, partly because of the MSPs that have announced they're standing down, also because some of the parties that had positive action measures are not going to feel they're not able legally to replicate them because of the position they're in just now. So I think we will take a step back in terms of candidates and those who are elected. But there's also becoming, so we're starting to see more focus put on the issue of women who are elected and the experience that they have, and some of the announcements of the women who have decided to stand down are quite striking in the extent to which they don't feel able to combine parliamentary representation with family life. They don't feel supported when they are here, that even within the Parliament itself, the atmosphere has been quite toxic, and it's not a pleasant experience, working environment. And then, of course, online abuse that I think all parliamentarians face. Some of the abuse that our female parliamentarians have faced online is horrific. I mean, obviously there's social media companies that could maybe do something about that, and that's as Chief Executive of the Parliament, you don't have an awful lot of influence over that. But I think the parties and the Parliament could do more to support and help women feel safe in their roles as elected representatives. And it's clear, there was an Engender report came out quite recently that did a survey of female candidates and of elected members, and some of the insights that are coming out of that are really quite startling, and I think there is just much more that we have to do to help our female parliamentarians feel safe enough to be able to do their jobs.
You've been very patient with us, so please put your question.
Hi everyone. It's becoming increasingly apparent on a daily basis that Westminster policies are not providing Scottish solutions. Migration, welfare reform, inequality, the economy like Grangemouth, even now foreign affairs like Palestine. And I think this is only going to get worse with the prospect of a reform government in Westminster. We see people wanting us to work collaboratively. Is there any way to work collaboratively, or is independence the only way to square that circle?
Hayley, you talked earlier on about the need for collaboration, so I'm going to ask you to respond to that one first of all.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think there are ways that the left or could work more collaboratively outside of Scotland. I think the UK government's attention to create greater devolution in England means there's subnational structures forming. So Greater Manchester would be a good example, where their views and policies are very much aligned with what has been the left in Scotland for a long while. So I think there's ways that you can create collaborations that aren't necessarily with a reform government, if that was ever to be. Yeah, so I think, yeah, it would be tricky. In my professional and personal view, perhaps, to to make those alliances with a reform government. Yeah, is the answer independence? I've walked into this, haven't I? Like, I don't know. Maybe I'll just say I don't know. I don't know if that's the right answer. I don't know. Can I hand it to any of my panel?
I think Nicola's keen to help you out here.
So even if Scotland were to, so the process, if let's imagine the future scenario where there is a referendum and a majority vote yes, we're quite some ways away from that, I think, but imagine that is the scenario. The process of becoming independent would involve such intense collaboration with the UK government that my very strong advice to advocates of independence would be to work on that relationship now. Because you're going to need it. And we learned from the Brexit process about how long it takes, the importance of the relationships, and even post that transition, independence doesn't change geography. Mm-hmm. You still share an island and share the challenges that come from, or islands, and share the challenges that come from that. And there would be a need for ongoing collaboration anyway. So, of course, it's difficult and challenging, but I think it's about finding opportunities for sharing ideas, sharing plans potentially. One of the things I was going to say earlier in relation to something that Hayley was talking about, I would like to see a change of the discourse to something that we used to have, where what we've seen in relation to child poverty in particular, but other areas as well, is that there's a sort of one-upmanship that emerges in policy in Scotland, where if we're doing something and they're not, and therefore we're much better, and sometimes I think that sort of translates into we're a bit rubbish, but we're not as bad as they are, which is sort of not the best way, I think, of making public policy. But if we see devolution or self-government, or whatever form that takes, as an opportunity for trying out things, for demonstrating things. So the Scottish Child Payment has been a success. It will be a lot easier to deliver if we can demonstrate that success to the UK government, and if they were to replicate that, because that would help to address some of the fiscal challenges that Graham talks about. So seeing devolution as policy experimentation, of sharing the learning, of trying to tackle some of the challenges that are shared. And that gets harder the further apart ideologically you get. But it just has to be something that governments work towards. And the civil service helps that, because they remain the same, whoever is in charge ministerially. So nurturing those relationships is just really important.
I don't think we should let our other panel members off with getting away with not answering that question. So collaboration in a more polarised political relationship across the UK, and do we go it alone? So Shannon and then Graham.
Yeah, I wish I had a get out of jail free card, as having only been in Scotland 5 years and still sort of learning to understand the complex relationships between UK and Scotland. But I'll say that one of the things that, and maybe I'm just repeating what Nicholas said, one of the things that's really important here is understanding that cutting across ideological lines are these kind of basic realities. people need housing. People need health care. People need to feel that they have agency and that the future for their children is something that they can look forward to. And I think to the extent that we can refocus some of the conversations on these really fundamental shared realities that are connected to human flourishing, that are essential to human flourishing regardless of your ideological mindset or your political habits. To the extent that we can do that, we can, and if need be, bracket some of these other conflicts so that we can at least get to work on some of these fundamental challenges. And then those need to really be evidence-driven. So one of the things that happens as we become more ideological is we become less evidence-driven. And we start interpreting the evidence in light of our politics rather than letting the evidence shape our policy choices and our political preferences. So to the extent we can recognize that that's happening, recognizing that that has two effects, it drives us apart from one another and it makes us make bad choices that then create further problems that we then have fewer resources to solve. To the extent that we can have a conversation about what that's doing to us and has been doing to us in Scotland, in the UK, in other parts of the world, and then explicitly say we need to stop ourselves, right, from this vicious cycle of becoming more and more detached from evidence-driven policy choices and voting habits, and get back to this idea that if evidence can drive, doesn't mean evidence always leads us to make the right choice. Sometimes the evidence is incomplete, sometimes the evidence is misleading, but it's the best thing we've got, right? So the more that we can come together around these shared challenges that we all face and say, can we get back to the evidence? Can we ensure that we're gathering the evidence that isn't predetermined by ideological mindsets? And then try to be accountable to voters about what basis we've made our policy choices on and what the evidence is, to the extent that we can get back to that. And I know that sounds very idealistic, but there's no other way forward. There's no way out but through that return.
Graham?
Great. I'm very conscious as chair of the Fiscal Commission and politically impartial. I'm probably 20 seconds away from a front page splash in the newspaper. So I'll choose my answer very carefully. I mean, my general comment, and one of the things I always say about when asked the question about constitutional changes, that actually if you look at the big ticket items that face Scotland, they're there whatever constitutional settlement you have. Now you might have views about how advantageous you think a different settlement will be to achieve that, but the big ticket items about the ageing of the population, climate change, the rise of new economies, AI, etc., they will transcend any constitutional settlement. And I don't think it's an excuse on either side of the debate to say, if only we did that, or if only you did that, then things would be magically better, because we still will face the challenges of how do you pay for a health system with an ageing population? How do you align up not just local policies, but global policies, national policies, European policies to tackle climate change? And that will not change under any constitutional settlement. And I think that, again, coming back to the importance of the quality of the debate, I think having a really robust debate about what levers that we have control and what actual choices you can make in there is the most important bit for the election coming up in 2026.
That was well navigated. I'm just glad that I'm not answering questions. We're coming to the end of our time here, but we've got time for some quick questions if you can keep them brief, and the responses will be brief. Someone in the front row, and then we've got two people over here.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to reflect on the fact that you're talking all about gender, but we're not addressing the fact that the word trad wife has just entered the dictionary this week. So we're heading into almost a more sexist time than we have had in the past. And we've seen that in elections in Europe where women and men have voted very differently in Germany. And I wonder what that means for the Parliament and how committees work, and if different genders will be working together across party if they hold those views.
Nicola, can I come to you on that one, please?
I don't know is the honest answer. I mean, I think the experience of this Parliament has probably been that party ties are quite stronger than perhaps some of the architects of devolution would have liked in the committee system. So I honestly, we'll just have to wait and see who our parliamentarians are and how they work and how strong they work as parliamentarians across party divides or whatever other divides they may feel and identify with.
Okay, 2 questioners over here.
Hello. There's a major flaw in your discussion. Don't get a mic, please. So a major flaw in your discussion about collaboration and cooperation and things like that is, first of all, it's far too rational and far too sensible. If you look at the history of things, even the most of the stuff that goes on in Holyrood, it dances around the constitutional issue. Virtually everything that the SNP pro-indie administrations tried to do is undermined, and there's lots of examples for that. I mean, even, you know, like the Deposit Return Scheme, the Named Persons Act. I mean, if you look at all the reports that go into these tragedies, it's always, yeah, but this agency didn't know what that agency did, and yet everything they do tries to undermine these things. I mean, even the current UK government doesn't like to play nice with the Welsh administration, which, as you know, has for 25 years been a largely Labour-led administration. I think the difficulty, and if you look there, the collaborative is the big word. Most people in this room are interested in politics and we think all that kind of thing is quite sensible. The trouble is the people that get elected and the way that the media plays these things, it doesn't feel, any time, I'm quite sad, I can look at the debates in the chamber and committee rooms and all the rest of it, it's almost the point-scoring thing has to be the thing that wins. And it genuinely feels, and I'm a pro-indie person only because of the decision-making powers it will give you, but it genuinely feels that everything certain parties do is designed to do nothing but undermine the party in power that are trying to do. Now, I'm not saying they get everything right by all means, but in many respects they try to do that. And very lastly, I had an interesting conversation with Professor Danny Doyling yesterday, and he was quite complimentary about some of the things that happen in Scotland, like the child payment and all the rest of it. And he says that when he's talking in England and talking to the media, and I'm talking about government departments and BBC and all the rest of it, he's not allowed to mention these things because they don't want to know, they don't want people to know if other parts of the UK are doing things better. So I think the whole collaborative thing is great, but it won't happen. That's my view. It won't happen.
Okay, Hayley, failings in collaboration, how does that affect delivery of social policy? So
I don't know if I fully agree. I think there are some successes in collaboration that take place, the civil servants and other kind of groups. I also agree with the frustration of the game of politics compared to policy, what we'd like to see. You know, I think we all stopped watching like Prime Minister's Question Time during lockdown and things. Like, it isn't enjoyable to watch, and it's quite frustrating, especially if there's something you're interested in that you want to see change and people's lives improve. Like, it's not a fun part of doing this kind of work. But I think there are collaborations that work, and I think there are ways to collaborate. I disagree with Danny Doyling. Like, we do a lot of work down south that are interested in what's happening in Scotland. Scotland's interested in what's happening in Northern Ireland, Wales. Like, there is a lot of shared learning, even with the DWP. And I say that with some hesitation because for many years I couldn't say that. But currently the DWP's had a culture shift towards being interested in what's happening and trying to make changes. I'm not saying it's as much as I'd like to see, and I think there is more collaboration that could happen. But I do think there are people in the systems who are keen to make it work and are trying their very best to make collaboration work, even with those agencies that are struggling to work together. Individuals can't address institutional and structural problems, so it does need leadership to come in and say, this has to work, you have to work together. And maybe we need bolder leaders that are more interested in doing that. But I don't know how that works with party politics and if they're allowed to do that. Yeah.
Okay, what will have to be a final question from the floor? Yeah.
Raising money from where it's needed, council tax. Is anybody ever going to get round to addressing that? It's not tied to Westminster. It's a Scottish power. We've had it a long time, but there has been no re-evaluation of the Scottish property stock since 1991.
I think I'd like to hear from both Graham and Nicola on this one. So over to you, Graham, first of all.
I mean, it's a great question, and it's one of the really fascinating puzzles, I think, about public policy development and public policy in Scotland. And we've just had a debate about constitutional change. We had a debate about collaboration. This is a policy that is set in Scotland in collaboration with local government. That there is wide consensus, I think, across most political parties, across most kind of academics and tax specialists, that council tax is not a great tax. It's regressive, even with the reforms that are there. It doesn't provide local autonomies in the same way, and it is ripe for reform. We've obviously had two governments that have tried to reform it. So Jack McConnell government tried to reform it. Then when John Swinney was finance minister in the first term of the SNP, they tried to reform it as well, and both instances have failed. And there've been all manner of different reports there. So I think two answers to your question. I think it is from a tax idea, it's an area that is ripe for reform. I think there's a broader question about why it's not been reformed, and I guess a reflection of our policy debate and a reflection of to be able to grasp really tricky, difficult issues, and why have we not made the reforms needed there? So I think there's a broader question that arises from your really good question about council tax.
Thank you. Nicola.
So maybe link the last two questions together because I think they are related. So I think that it's absolutely in need of reform, unquestionably, and it's a reform that would create some winners and a lot of losers. And anything like that is very difficult for politicians. And I think that's where there are opportunities. So I think that it would have to be, because of the nature of that party political battle, there would have to be some sort of process that helps you to navigate that. Maybe doing something within Parliament, not just leaving it to government, or taking a challenging and tricky issue like that and bringing in a citizens forum, some sort of deliberative process. So you help to one of the beauties of deliberative democracy, there are many beauties of it in that they educate, they inform, they empower, is that it also helps and enables government to do the really difficult things, and it helps them to manage that sort of deeply polarised party political context that often makes it harder for them to do the difficult things. And it also takes really bold leadership. And going back to one of the things, the slides earlier about what do you want, what's your number one message to the next parliamentarians? Be bold. We need them to, we need some people to step up and try and tackle some of these issues head on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your contributions so far. I've got one more question for you before we start to wind up through the Slido app. If we can have that up, please. I'm getting the message that it's not quite working. The question was about whether, on the basis of what you've heard today, how confident you were that the new intake would be able to tackle these issues. But maybe yeah, I'm seeing some reaction in the back, which is giving me an idea. Okay, I'm just going to ask our panel members for a quick 1 minute reflection each on what they've heard today, and I'm going to start with Shannon and just come back down the line.
Yeah. I'll just say that I think one of the things we need to address is the kind of wider disillusionment with politics as a whole, and think about how Scotland can break through that cynicism and that disillusionment and that fatalism, and whether we can look for and lift up candidates who do have this boldness and who do have this more encompassing vision of Scotland, rather than one that's broken down into those constituencies and those ideological camps that have come to kind of fracture our politics. So there is an opportunity here to, from candidates themselves, set a new tone and really inspire people. It's an opportunity. When people are cynical and feeling like politics doesn't offer hope, there is a real hunger there that can be fed. Sometimes it gets fed by demagogues, so we have to guard against that. But it can be fed by people who are genuinely committed to kind of starting politics again in a new key. So we need to look for those voices and then come together and support those candidates as best we can.
Okay.
I can't say any better than what Shannon said there. I think the next election, and everybody says the next election is really important, but this election is so important given the scale of the challenges that we face, the timing of when these challenges will start to hit. And I think the importance of electing wise politicians, bold politicians, collaborative politicians is going to be absolutely fundamental. And I think there's a real onus on everybody in this room and outside to make sure that happens.
Yeah, I think that the nature of our electoral system means that there are often things to play for in every bit of the country, and so there is a real opportunity for you to use your voice to be heard. And my encouragement would be to try and challenge the claims, particularly if candidates make it sound like there are easy fixes to things. They're probably not. So push back and demand a little bit deeper thought and deeper analysis of those claims. We will do our bit to try and help with that. The Centre for Public Policy will try and run a fact-checking service to try and bring that evidence into the debate, to be able to challenge some of those claims. But my encouragement to you would be just use your voice, because they are listening.
I agree with everything that's been said. Just to add, I'd like also to see, the Scottish Parliament had a focus on social justice. I think that thread's carried through for a number of years, but I think it could be renewed, and I'd like to see caring politicians as well. So not just technical and have certain ability, but actually care about the people that they're trying to make quite bold changes for.
So thank you. I would love to hear your feedback on today's event or your views on the festival. So you can use the QR codes. There are paper copies at the back of the room, so please feel free to give us your feedback. But I would just like to finish today by asking you to thank our panel for their contributions and their insights today. So Shannon, Graham, Nicola. And most of all, thank you for spending time with us this morning. There are other events on at the festival this afternoon, so please have a look at that. Whatever you choose to do, have a good afternoon. Thank you.